When a science is still new, and thus powerfully drawing upon the new scientist's creativity, certain errors in logic may arise, but these inconsistencies, born of an imagination still ranging the plane of the new knowledge, are inevitable when the subject of observation is humankind. The early psychologists, yet unfettered by a hardened methodology, were in possession of a descriptive language nearly vanished in the modern discipline. Evocative, inaccurate, poetical, pretentious, compassionate, and invasive, these early works resound with a humane timbre dryly absent from the mundane and correct definitions of madness in 1996, as exemplified in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which has not progressed mightily in a comprehension of the sexual paraphilias. Though the great doctor Krafft-Ebing opens himself to scorn with his at times antique moral stances, I hope to yet elicit an appreciation of such passionate revulsions, for I feel they reflect a still valid set of human feelings, and act, even in their ancientness, as a kind of adjustment. Though there are now great advancements in toleration within the psychological sciences, we still ought not to delude ourselves in imagining humanity is now thus terrifically more evolved in stomaching sexual crime, sexual perversity, or even sex. There is still no more than the barest sufferance of those possessed of a sexual paraphilia, even when innocent of any trace of homicide, and we who now might, in modern American society, freely seek out and attain full knowledge of our favorite aberrations are, if truth be known, not much happier or self-accepting for all our greater evolutions in consciousness and our freedom of expression. And why should this be? Is it merely because society at large still cannot tolerate us? Or is it something deeper, a self-displeasure and loneliness that cannot be gratified, not even in orgasm? Could it be because such as we are, perverse and highly idiosyncratic, we find it virtually impossible to mate? Psychopathia Sexualis, resounding though it does with the doctor's disgusting, appalling, loathsome, still possesses, for me, a moral rigor that cannot ever be completely outdated. Such opinions have much force and import, not, however, because I concur, but I do not believe a doctor does his sufferer all the good service he might do in withholding his private moral point of view. Jung has stated that no beneficial abreaction can be effected in psychotherapy without a therapist's countertransference. That is, a patient's relief cannot be had without the therapist's emotional response. The psychotherapist in particular should clearly understand that psychic infections, however superfluous they seem to him, are in fact the predestined concomitants of his work, and thus fully in accord with the instinctive disposition of his own life. This realization gives him the right attitude to his patient. The patient means something to him personally, and thus provides the most favorable basis for treatment. Our trial as therapists, and our worst torment, is to somehow maintain our involvement with the patient and stay compassionate without becoming subject to the sufferer's needs. We are not, as therapists, required to hold a patient's hand or even to much like them, but a force of kindness, coupled with the will for the sufferer's eventual psychic prosperance, are the metaphysical tools we wield. And it seems to me that this faculty is borne upon the moral opinions of the therapist. Moral opinion is a redundancy, opinion itself being the form of truth admixed or degraded by the private sense of right and wrong. Opinion illustrates a particular quality of mind. Certain sensibilities cannot as adeptly penetrate those unlike it, as it can those very like. I have also, as part of my work as a professional dominatrix, that is, in DSM-3 terms, as a provider of paraphiliac experience, been witness to hundreds of manifestations of aberrant sexual behavior, and have learned how paradoxically valuable and dangerous the clearly stated opinion, very often a revulsion, can be. One can state aloud that a behavior is nauseating without having to demonstrate nausea, but to pretend one is objectively above any feeling of nausea is to rob the client of a moral context. The client has sought out a doctor, therapist, or dominatrix because they are suffering, and very often it is not because of the nature of their desire, but because they hate desire, would like to kill it, would prefer to feel nothing. Krafft-Ebing's diagnoses and propositions for cure, we do admit, are seriously outdated, for he firmly believed that simple abstinence would result in the death of the desire. However, in modern psychoanalysis, this ideal is still very often proffered as the best palliative. This absurdity was, and is, the root of continuous suffering, not to mention financial exploitation. Krafft-Ebing's faithful cure-all for homosexuality was heterosexual marriage. This is his diagnosis from case 134. To strengthen the sexual inclination for the opposite sex, which was defective, but not absolutely wanting. Thank heavens, a tinge of the normal. Let us focus on that. This could be done by avoiding and opposing all homosexual feelings and impulses, possibly with the help of artificial inhibitory influences of hypnotic suggestion, removal of homosexual desires by suggestion, by the excitation and exercise of normal sexual desires and impulses, by complete abstinence from masturbation, and the eradication of the remnants of the neurasthenic condition of the nervous system by means of hydrotherapy, spa bathing, or the infamous bondage in a bathtub, and possibly general Faradization, the earliest form of electroshock. We shudder at the use of general. Let us stop for a moment to define the antique term neurasthenia, which the doctor uses continually. The dictionary states it is obsolete, denoting a generalized nervous debility and an atonic, or non-vital, condition of the nerves. Today, such a state as Krafft-Ebing observes would be diagnosed as chronic depression, with its attendant apathy of interest, dissociative sensations in the body. One feels oneself to be numb or strangely detached from the physical, to the point of being two persons in one, beset with a sense of futility, worthlessness, and the necessity of suicide, perhaps coupled with sporadic obsessive or paranoid thinking. All these symptoms betoken the blockage of the libido, or the stream of natural vital energy, which must naturally result from that very abstinence, eradication, and removal of desire the doctor has designed as a cure for the patient. The principle of satiation is utterly unthinkable to the doctor. Our modern implosion therapy of acting out a fantasy in a controlled environment was almost unknown, except in certain specialized brothels of the era. Neither knew he anything of aversion therapy, whereby one is made to indulge so mightily that boredom is the result, where once excitement ruled. The principle of sexual fantasy being an ever-fluent, always-changing faculty was alien to him, because he lived in a culture where a no was the answer to sexual paraphilia. Yet this is still not to say that our modern yes is any better the solution. For we must here state that a solution, a cure, a return to normality can be very harmful, even dangerous, to the psyche of the paraphiliac. It is often sadistically irresponsible for a doctor to proffer a cure for we, the truly incurable. How might we return to where we never were? Cure might act as the horrible lie that keeps the sufferer subject to his doctor. He may even be victimized, especially financially. Cure takes from him the sense that he might be something, a type, to be valued in itself. Control is always necessary, of course, but self-control is the ideal. But this does not mean suppression. Krafft-Ebing himself demonstrates, almost despite himself, the near impossibility of change. How many of his 238 cases altered their sexuality permanently, became normal under his treatments? Though we dislike him for it, the doctor believed that the paraphilias were expressive of a moral condition, often of a low nature. And a moral condition, once suffering degradation, is rarely correctable. But what the modern dislikes Krafft-Ebing for is what I find in him most fascinating, for I consider this question of a moral fiber still unresolved, highly flammable, and in our bland era, extremely to the point. Why does it give a sufferer such hope, such pleasure, to hear a doctor say, "You can learn to become the person for whom such behavior would be impossible"? Such a statement was once made to me by a therapist in my early years of desperate desire to not be a sadomasochist. Why did I spend thousands of dollars? Why did I deny myself masturbatory pleasure? Why did I hate my desire so intensely? Because I still believed in sexual evil, and the fantasy of cure was a religious faith, linking me to God and all that was good. "I want to be good. I want to be good," cries little Alex, the sociopath in A Clockwork Orange. This very desire becomes his downfall. We are not blackboards that can be erased. Our actions do mark us, and for life. There has been reflected in psychiatry, and especially in the criminal justice system, a kind of stupid optimism about the ability of people to change, especially if it is true, as so proposed, that the behavior that must be changed is reflective of innate character, which we might also define as a self-pleasing stylistic aberration of thought. We observe this most glaringly in the multitude of cases detailing aspects of homosexual behavior. These might be profitably read even by those proponents of a stringent political correctness. Anyone who has studied moral revolutions knows what is proper today shall probably not be so considered a mere decade later, for right or wrong. And to read the concealed mass of poor opinions, expressions of self-hatred, cruel acts by the family, punishment by civil authorities, distress of wives and children, etc., etc., is to see the terrible contemporaneity in it all still. A moral lesson is contained in these details of insane and inane persecution and destroyed lives. We cannot ask the world to hold our hand or even like us. Any medicine required by our suffering must be generated, as it were homeopathically, from within ourselves. We should not forget the good Dr. Krafft-Ebing himself calls for a decriminalization of consensual homosexual behavior, an opinion that helped blacken his reputation and discredited him in many serious medical circles for the rest of his professional career. But homosexuality has disappeared from the DSM-3 as a sexual disorder. Inadvertently, from our distance, many of the cases are perfectly hilarious. In case 146 of Dr. XY, he was, after a long career of successful homosexual indulgence, kept strictly hidden away, discovered at midnight groveling in an open field with a tramp, engaged in mutual fellation. What joy he must have been feeling, to grab that instant of recognition, to thrill himself thus in the darkness. I like to imagine the crazy horror of the night watchman, who fell over the ecstatic bodies on that country path. It was he who recognized the doctor and reported him to the local magistrate. The state prosecutor's office decided not to institute proceedings since there had been no public scandal and insertion of the penis in the anus had not taken place. This doctor's case is a real pleasure to read after all the many other unhappy stories of homosexual life. Dr. XY insisted on writing out his sexual biography for Krafft-Ebing. His level of self-acceptance in an unbelievably repressive society is quite heartening. Courage, strength of mind, and the refusal to be or feel persecuted are some of his qualities not shared by most of the other paraphiliacs. He was a resolved and loving man who, when denounced, wisely fled until the brouhaha blew over. I felt obliged to leave Germany and seek myself a new home, where neither law nor public opinion would be opposed, good luck, to what, like all abnormal urges probably, could not be suppressed by mere strength of will. Since I did not doubt for one moment that my tendencies were contrary to current social concepts, I repeatedly tried to master my desire, but the only result was to intensify them. And what was the doctor to do with case 138, whose affliction was again a type of dystonic homosexuality, that is, a homosexuality from which number 138 could receive no pleasure? We note how Krafft-Ebing would first observe if his patient suffered from neurasthenia, i.e. some form of depression. Number 138 did not, yet after a course of water cures for homosexuality, this very attempt superinduced neurasthenia. In other words, the stress of the cure, of trying to become normal, made the man sicker than he had been at the start. And the way the case is written, it even appears as if heterosexual intercourse itself made him more ill. He only improved after the birth of his first child. The pressure was off. He had done his procreative duty. He might now righteously forever refrain from intercourse with his wife. Sad to consider, however, his fearful celibate existence, chiefly because he was haunted by the thought of procreating an offspring afflicted with his own anomaly. Cruelly, Krafft-Ebing does not disabuse him of this fantasy, that homosexuality is hereditary. All the more hypocritical, thus, for the doctor to encourage the homosexual to marry in order to be cured, hoping for a plethora of future patients, doctor? We must consider here, too, the terrible anguish and unhappiness foisted upon a generation of women who had no experience or understanding of sex, much less paraphilias, forced by society to remain married to odd, cold, and perverse husbands. Women are employed time and time again by both the doctor and his patients as a kind of sexual testing ground. If of the same social class as the sufferer, the women were doomed to the homosexual, the sadist, the fetishist, simply through being a societal force towards normality. If of the lower classes, again were such women, described by the doctor as low in character, bad, of morally degraded nature, given the task of cure. Over and over are the male sufferers described as going to a brothel to be cured. There were no decent women in their own sexual class with whom they might engage in experimental sex. Thus were prostitutes high and low, given the task of creating normality. For this they were of course given due credit and high honors in society. This latter aspect of Krafft-Ebing's work fascinates me. To understand that certain specific strands of information about aberrant behavior would not have been unearthed from the darkness had not a prostitute spoken out, or had a male patient not acted out with a woman for hire and confessed his antics to the doctor. Certain types of activity, flagellation, or vile degradations could never become manifest except with a low woman. This we understand, though Krafft-Ebing did not, was not because she was an evil inciter, but because a prostitute, in order to be successful, must be eminently agreeable, tolerant, often compassionate, with an interest in her client's relief, whatever form that might take. Thus did these women of low character provide both the sufferer and his physician with some knowledge in the form of discoveries. Some self-understanding was certainly garnered. The prostitutes and the permissions they granted were a means to that complete physical knowledge, which is more than just an eye could witness or a doctor's ear could hear of. They were not just a mirror, but a whole person against whom to react, and with whom to enact a driving, desperate need. Often this act was not one of love. Again and again Krafft-Ebing mentions how, as an expedient, a sufferer tried to cure himself by visiting brothels. In other words, success with the prostitute was for these men a kind of standard for the norm, proved that normal sexual behavior was possible for them. These women, despised and reviled then, and now, acted as a kind of testing ground for the sexual health of a male. The restraints, rules, financial commitments, and social expectations of all attendant upon sex with a good woman, a wife, creates in men such mental stress that, when in need of the simple animal experience, they would consort with the bad woman, who paradoxically could cure them of their socially unacceptable sexual appetite. Prostitutes are therefore a kind of specialized drain for the excess sexuality of the male population. Without such a drain, distressing, even disgusting backups occur. Yet no one loves that necessary drain. The prostitute absorbs all the evil, so the men can be good again, but the evil, in passing through her, somehow taints her. Thus she is, and will be forever, bad. We also note that most of the time such attempts to be cured met with failure. It only seemed to confirm to the homosexual, the fetishist, the pederast that their real satisfaction lay in their paraphilia. They needed that sharper, more dangerous orgasm. The hygienic, feeble spasm realized through the normal act bored them. Very often the mere sight of the naked female form, a rare sight in those days of little commercial pornography, set them to flight. Or the man proved to be utterly impotent. Or, through repeated tries, he discovered that a combination of normal heterosexual intercourse coupled with mental images of, say, a shiny boot could bring satisfaction. Never was the knowledge gained put to waste. The sexual tragedies foisted upon a generation of women by urging these therapeutically repressed cases to marry can only be imagined. How ill-adept such women were in dealing with sex, much less a husband possessed of a sexual peculiarity. Misery was foisted upon the unsuspecting proper wife of case 137, the boot lover whose fondest desire was to grovel at a lackey's shining boots, to exchange status with a working man and slaver over his booted heel. Forced by his family to marry, the details of his cure are pathetic and desperate. At last he hits upon the expedient of having the boots suspended above the bed during marital intercourse. This he discovered to work during a session with, who else? A prostitute. Among those colleagues from around the world from whom Krafft-Ebing gathered information on the paraphilias, we must include the women of low character. He describes their roles as sexual functionaries, always granting full credence to their testimonies. Their accounts are never derided or disbelieved. There is a reason for this, perhaps, in that he did have respect for them. Otherwise, he need not have mentioned their participation at all. But in the end, what behavior worked most agreeably toward maintaining that ineluctable ideal, the social order? The man left quietly to his beloved lackey's boots, or the same worshipper shoehorned into an ill-fitting conventional marriage? Of course, today we know the answer to this question, or think we do. The writing style of Krafft-Ebing is what most engages one today. Lively, florid, poetic, sometimes inspired, it reveals, despite its moral slant, a deep and involved interest in his client's every facet of life. He did not assume that certain facts were unimportant. His persona medici drops continually under the spell of the very telling detail. One is never bored by a facile, correct presentation, by a saint-like automaton of impossible objectivity, whereas one has to suspect some obfuscation, some elisions, some loss of refinement in our modern non-judgmental appearances. For example, in describing cases of exhibitionism, we are impressed by the many subjective descriptions of the inner states of the sufferer, especially the strange, preliminary dream states they seem to fall into prior to, and sometimes during, their acts. It was as if he were waking from a dream, felt excited and restless some hours before his criminal acts, and experienced a feeling of fear with oppression and congestion in the head. It is with some amusement that we note these exhibitionist behaviors often incurred in or before churches, that one such sufferer also was given to stealing cigars, that one had never had the intention to offend women. Another would announce, "I have a beautiful penis, come to me and stroke it." As precursors to such attacks, he often had, a short time before, had flames before the eyes and vertigo. He would grow terribly hot, terribly frightened, his head would burn, and he would seem to be in a fog, but he never lost consciousness. At the same time, he would have violent, darting pain in the testicles and spermatic cords. Krafft-Ebing's observations thus retain an illustrative power for those of us engaged in the science of sex, who are sometimes bored, one might say even satiated, by the fervent predictability of the paraphilias. The physical descriptions he inserts would never be found in today's correct psychology texts, yet even in their quaintness they add appreciably to our comprehension of both patient and doctor. The older material is somehow fresher, points to a certain present devolution in language and consciousness within psychoanalytic history. For example, Case 192. His conduct was open, his mane gay, eye red and bright, head hot, his glance uncertain, with an unmistakable expression of lasciviousness. Case 210. B, age 37, made a peculiar impression owing to his dandified dress and affected manner. Such habits were, for no doubt, a sign of the morally insane. His eyes had a neuropathic, languishing expression. Around his mouth played a smile of self-satisfaction. Case 160. She had regular orgies with the finger and tongue, sometimes for hours, until she collapsed in a state of exhaustion. I am certain it is disturbing to some that an infamous pervert such as myself should have been asked to reflect upon so great a work as Psychopathia Sexualis, and to critique so distinguished a scientist as Krafft-Ebing. Former editions were prefaced by medical man of stern mien, that a type of articulate maniac afflicted with graphomania, as per Nordau in his Degeneration, 1895, a chronically inclined sadomasochist and leather fetishist should somehow be considered worthy of now pronouncing upon the value of so serious a work. I, whose case profile would assuredly have relegated me to a prison for the criminally insane, today scribble away in graphophiliac joy, rampant and free from the confines of Krafft-Ebing's diagnoses. Yet while I am not unqualified, both as a professional dominatrix and a forensic psychologist, to apprentice myself to the task of introducing the work of my colleague, I do sympathize with his intent to catalog and thus control the plethora of aberrations still rampaging throughout modern society. Thus, In compassionate response to the good doctor shuddering and flipping sideways in his grave, sideways in honor of the aberrant, I here analyze myself as a case of the doctor's in his near inimitable style. Case 239, Sadomasochism. Miss T.S., age 44, sadomasochist, bisexual, family alcoholic, mother neuropathically tainted, father incarcerated as embezzler, professional gambler when she was 4 years old, nervous from early childhood, insomnia, given to nocturnal frights, parents given to violent arguments, no early masturbation, spasms of sexual frigidity in early teens and 20s coupled with indifferent style of promiscuity, religious preoccupations, belief in her innate evil, discovery of writings of Marquis de Sade confirmed her in her proclivities, periods of celibacy, sense of guilt, desire for suicide, given to self-punishment through drugs, alcohol, and inappropriate sexual partners. At age 18, fell in love with a young man, her social superior, was dominated sexually, first experiences at hands of a sadist, scenes of rape and humiliation, parents incapable of keeping her in university, incomplete education, refusal to return home, parents divorced, gravitated to New York City to fulfill artistic ambitions, vacillated between becoming an actress or a writer, experiments in lesbian sex, increasing disgust for the male, fascination with lesbian subculture in sex business circa 1970s, and the possibilities of cynical profit to be made from sexual exploitation of herself, drunkenness increased, drug taking, experimental sex compounded by frigidity, increasing depression and accompanying dissociative effects, involved in exotic dancing, incapable of actual prostitution due to innate aversion to the male body, began the practice of sadomasochistic prostitution by age 24, wrote a book on the subject, The Correct Sadist, still in print, considered in sadomasochistic underground to be a classic in the pornographic genre. Though in psychoanalysis off and on from age 15 until age 36, she remains an unregenerate professional proselytizer for sadomasochistic practices, degenerated into madame, pimp for masochistic men, lesbianism more deeply entrenched, male transvestism, courts female prospects to train as sadistic prostitutes for her profitable sex business, unrepentantly perverted in her tastes, delusions of grandeur, being above the law, fantasy that her favored form of sexuality may soon become socially acceptable, delusions of literary grandeur, acceptance of a new work on sadomasochism, dungeon evidence, detailing case studies of her masochist clients, further confirms her in her fantasy of social sanction. Aspect of the sociopathic antisocial personality in her completion of university studies, B.A., summa cum laude in forensic criminal psychology. This accomplishment did not inspire her to forgo her profession as dominatrix. Instead, she cynically subsumed her scientific knowledge into further investigations, perfecting the arts of her beloved field, sadomasochism. Misanthropic, pessimist, deterministic, strains of apathy, some schizoid traits, danger in her posing as a doctor and authority as she is able to speak in articulate fashion on her subject, recommendation, incarceration. Her pathological proselytizing renders her a danger to others. Terence Sellers, 1996.